Welcome to NDE Insight Channel. Today, our narrator, Tsuruhiko Kiuchi, is a well-known scientist in the international astronomical community. This pure scientist has no beliefs or religion. He possesses a rigorous scientific attitude and scientific literacy beyond ordinary people. His academic achievements in astronomy are also remarkable. He alone discovered 4 new comets, making him one of the astronomers who discovered the most comets in the past 100 years. The international astronomical community even named a small asteroid after him. However, despite being a renowned international astronomer, he authored a book specifically describing his posthumous experiences, guaranteeing that the accounts in this book are experiences he repeatedly verified. He created a stunning world record of near-death experiences. Let's start from the first part of his near-death experience.
It was when I was 22 years old, serving as a flight dispatcher in the Air Self-Defense Force at the Hyakuri Base in Ibaraki Prefecture. I had just finished my night duty and was admiring the beautiful sunrise and the gradually brightening eastern sky from the tower when suddenly an unprecedented severe pain struck my abdomen. I felt cold sweat pouring down and then lost consciousness abruptly. A colleague who noticed the anomaly immediately called an ambulance and rushed me to the emergency center. My abdomen kept swelling, and the intense pain mercilessly consumed me. I woke up in pain repeatedly, only to faint again, as if enduring torment in hell. Later, I learned that I had intestinal obstruction, specifically in the duodenum, caused by pressure from the spine and artery, an extremely rare condition with only 120 documented cases worldwide, and no one had ever been successfully revived. When I arrived at the medical university, my stomach had swollen to its limit. They attempted to clear the contents stuck in my stomach. The tube inserted through my nose extracted fluid from my stomach. Typically, the stomach's capacity is only about 1.4 kilograms, but they drew out 5 kilograms of fluid, astonishing the doctors who expressed relief that my stomach didn't rupture. Consequently, my body rapidly dehydrated, causing my weight to drop from 72 kilograms the previous day to just 42 kilograms the next day. The functions of all internal organs, including the heart, kidneys, and liver, deteriorated rapidly, and I was in critical condition. Under such circumstances, not only was surgery impossible, but even a physical examination was out of the question. I lingered on the brink of death, experiencing tunnels, flower seas, and transcendence. I lay on the hospital bed, in a state of chaos, hearing the doctor say, "You only have about a week at most." I fought against the unbearable pain while bewilderedly thinking, do I only have a week left in my life? Despite this, my father pleaded desperately with the doctors, even if it was just for an X-ray examination. Please, help him again. For a father to watch his son die inexplicably and helplessly must have been unbearable. The medical staff injected contrast medium through the nasal tube into my extremely weak body. But my body couldn't bear such a burden. When the X-ray examination was almost over, I once again fell into critical condition, as if a gate had suddenly closed. I lost consciousness instantly, and when I regained consciousness, I found myself in total darkness. I looked around, unable to determine my location. At that moment, I saw a light in the distance. I began to crawl towards the light. Strangely, I distinctly felt myself crawling, as if crawling in a field. I felt the sticky sensation of mud as I grabbed it, and it flowed through my fingers. The sensation was very real. After crawling for a while, I finally crawled out. When I looked back, I realized I had been in a cave-like tunnel. The light source I had seen in the distance was still there. In the far distance, it was not as glaring as the sun but rather resembled a faint firelight from burning wood. By then, I could stand, so I began to walk towards the light. There was no one around, just me alone. I continued forward with a vague feeling. I don't remember if I was wearing clothes, but I was sure I was barefoot because I could feel the prickly grass under my feet. After walking for a while, I encountered a wide river. I thought, could this be the legendary river of forgetfulness on the road to the afterlife? The light was on the other side. The dim light illuminated the surroundings. In any case, let's cross over and take a look. With that in mind, I began to look for a boatman. There was no one around. I searched along the riverbank covered with reeds and finally found a nearly unusable wooden boat. There were no oars on the boat, but at least the boat itself seemed capable of floating on the water. After pushing the boat into the middle of the river and boarding it, I tried to paddle with my hands, and the boat seemed to move forward. After finally reaching the other side, I collapsed on the grass due to exhaustion. I don't know how long passed, but when I inadvertently looked up, I saw about 15 to 20 meters away, a light flickering like a campfire, with 4 or 5 figures in the swaying light. Then one of them walked towards me, a middle-aged woman in mourning clothes. I didn't actually know who she was. Later, I realized she looked exactly like one of my aunts who had passed away shortly after my birth. She was very young at the time. The woman in mourning clothes said to me, "Tsuruhiko, why are you here?" I couldn't answer at the time because I couldn't understand the situation myself. When I was at a loss, the woman took me to the campfire. There were 2 old ladies, an old man, and a young man. I didn't know who the elderly were, but when I saw the young man's face, I was stunned. He was my cousin who had died prematurely in his 20s after being crushed by a bulldozer a few years ago. We were both delighted to reunite and had a lively conversation. Afterwards, the woman in mourning clothes came to my side and said, "Come with me." After bidding farewell to my cousin and the others, I followed the woman and walked for a while until we saw a gentle slope leading to a small hill. There were no trees on the hill, just a grassy plain. The woman kept walking up the hill, and when we finally reached the top, the other side of the hill was a vast sea of flowers. The gentle slope was covered in flowers in full bloom. I couldn't understand what kind of flowers they were, but I could smell a pleasant fragrance. Looking up at the sky, golden light emanated from above. The tremendous golden light made everything shimmer with dazzling brilliance. Surrounded by an unprecedented sense of happiness, I slowly descended the hillside covered with colorful flowers. As I walked, I saw a cluster of light emerge from the sky, dragging a residual shadow like a dragon wandering in the air. Then it flew towards me and stared at me. At that moment, I seemed to see a face in the light, although I didn't know who it was. It seemed to be a noble and beautiful woman. If I had a religious belief, I would probably think she was the Virgin Mary or Guanine. I continued down the gentle slope, and only then did I realize that the woman in mourning clothes had disappeared at some point. As I looked around, there was suddenly a light, floating sensation that awakened me, much like the feeling of suddenly waking up from a dream. I found myself back in the hospital bed, my consciousness existing outside of my body. Above me, there were electric lights and 4 drips, and my mother sat beside me. What just happened? Was it all a dream? Did I miraculously come back to life? Then, I suddenly realized that the excruciating pain that had consumed my entire body had completely vanished. My consciousness was so clear, yet I felt no pain whatsoever. The agony that felt like my entire body was being crushed had completely disappeared. I wanted to press the emergency call button in my hand to ask the doctors what was happening, but inexplicably, I couldn't summon the strength. At that moment, I knew my heartbeat had stopped because the pounding pulse had suddenly ceased. Then, even my breathing stopped. Exhale, inhale, exhale, and after one last deep breath, I could no longer continue breathing. It's said that humans let out their first cry upon birth, exhaling, and death is marked by inhaling. I thought to myself at the time, so this saying is true. Even though I couldn't breathe, there was surprisingly no pain. My mother stared at my face, shaking my body and crying, "He's dead." Later, when I asked about this incident, I heard that she had seen my neck suddenly go limp. She woke my father, who was sleeping by the bed, and then there was a commotion. During this time, my consciousness remained present. It was a strange feeling, unlike the dream I had in the cave and the sea of flowers. This time, it was just like being alive, except without the pain. I felt as though I were fully present in reality, except for the absence of pain. Because my father stood by my feet, looking at me with a panicked expression, I assured him that I was fine. But he showed no reaction. I called out to him again, but our eyes never met. He wasn't looking at my face but at my abdomen. Confused, I tried to sit up on the bed, but then I turned my head and saw my body lying on the bed. I felt puzzled. I had clearly stood up from the bed, right in front of my father, but my body was still lying on the bed. What was going on? I realized at that moment that I wasn't in my own body but in my consciousness. So, I could only explain it like this: the person lying on the bed wasn't me, but someone else who looked exactly like me. I watched with my father as I lay on the bed, and then I shouted "Dad" to my father beside me. Suddenly, my consciousness shifted, and I became my father's perspective, staring at my body lying on the bed. In other words, I had entered my father's body. That's when I understood why my father had been looking at my abdomen. It was because my face, or rather, my body's face, was in that position. In other words, what my father saw wasn't me with consciousness, but my physical body. I finally understood why our gazes hadn't met earlier. So, I reassured my father, "I'm fine." And then, I naturally left my father's body. Afterwards, my father said he had heard my voice saying, "I'm fine," and because I said I was fine, he believed I would come back to them. Although my father didn't believe I had briefly possessed him, he admitted to hearing my voice at that moment. Nurses rushed into the room and put an oxygen mask on my body. The room was in chaos. I thought to myself, I'm just getting in the way by standing at the bedside, so I reflexively stepped aside to let the nurse pass. But my consciousness had no body. Now, thinking back, maybe there was no need to move aside at all. Another nurse sat directly on my body lying on the bed and began performing chest compressions. My father and I watched at the bedside, watching myself. It was an indescribable feeling. Suddenly, I noticed that my mother, who had been by the bedside earlier, had disappeared. I wondered, where did she go? In an instant, I moved to my mother's side. She was near the hospital entrance, trying to contact relatives from a public phone. My emotionally confused mother couldn't even dial the phone properly. I saw her repeatedly dialing the wrong numbers and tried to help by looking at the phone book and telling her the relatives' phone numbers, but she seemed completely unable to hear my voice. My mother called relatives, telling them I had just taken my last breath. Despite my loud shouts in her ear that I was still alive and fine, my mother couldn't hear me. At that moment, I started wondering what my sisters were doing. So I immediately moved to my sister's side again. My brother-in-law was driving, and I was sitting in the middle of my sisters. I could hear everything my sisters and brother-in-law were saying, but they were discussing funeral arrangements. So I had to start shouting, "I'm still alive." Come to think of it, as long as I think of something in my heart, I can go wherever I want. I don't even know how to explain this incredible phenomenon. The more I think about it, the more amazing it seems. Later, I tried thinking about the hospital room, and sure enough, I instantly returned to the hospital room. There were nurses, doctors, and others crowded around the bed, and the situation was chaotic. I stood behind them, watching. This scene is truly indescribable. But everyone was desperately trying to save my body, and I gradually found it interesting. If the world is composed of length, width, and height, forming a three-dimensional world, then adding a time axis, which is the space between the past and the future, where one can move freely, is the fourth-dimensional space. Add consciousness, and consciousness can move freely, and this world becomes the fifth-dimensional world. Perhaps after death, people will enter the fifth-dimensional world. In the fifth-dimensional world, I can enter my father's body and move to my mother's side at any time. Coincidentally, during that period, I was reading Einstein's theory of relativity, so I found the idea of being able to move instantly very intriguing. This is teleportation, right? This experience tells us that people don't die, it's our bodies that die, our souls. Consciousness has left and entered the fifth-dimensional space, where you can think of wherever you want to go, without the concept of space.